From 1980 to 2000, I led a team that compiled Media Network. We explored the background behind international broadcasting from the Second World War till the dawn of this millennium. Now it's time to share more untold stories with a second series, this time with a camera. Hello, this is Jonathan Marks here with some more interviews tracing the history of international sound broadcasting. It's now over 10 years since BBC World Service left Bush House on the Strand in London, and as they were leaving, I remember iconic posters that were in the windows were gradually removed. One always sticks in my mind because it was the philosophy I used at my work at Radio Netherlands. Audiences are at the heart of everything we do. That also reminds me of fantastic conversations with Dr. Graham Mytton, whom I knew as Head of Audience Research at BBC External Services. A specialist on Africa, I still have many questions about how the BBC's International Service researched its radio audience at the end of the last century. So when I discovered Graham had a Zoom account, I grabbed the opportunity to link up. So how did you organise BBC audience research in the 80s and 90s? Bearing in mind, I mean, there was no way that you could send people to individual villages to have the sort of conversations that you've just described.
We did actually. We did do that. I discovered when I came to the department that the department was doing quite well in terms of audience measurement, but there was a lot more that it could do in countries where we had surveys that had happened only in the cities. And I knew that it was perfectly possible, not too expensive and easy, really, to do research. By the way, people often say to me, because I became an expert and specialist in doing survey research in Africa, and I've done it even since I've been at the BBC, it's actually, I tell people quietly, don't tell anybody, it's actually terribly easy. The easiest continent in the world to do face-to-face interviewing is Africa, without any question. After I left the BBC, I ran the first ever national audience survey in the Gambia, and then I did the same in Sierra Leone, and I did the same in South Sudan and in East Timor, in Indonesian archipelago, and I did surveys elsewhere. But the best audience and market researchers always have a problem: people who refuse. And in Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, typically 30, 40, 50% refusals. In Gambia, 0. Sierra Leone, 1, 2%. South Sudan, a bit higher because people are a bit nervous about political interference, and maybe you're not really an audience researcher. Maybe you're coming from the other tribe or the other group or some surveillance people. We don't trust you. So there it was about 15, 20%. But generally speaking, in Africa, the refusal rate was very, very low. People love being asked questions. They love talking about things. They like talking about what they listen to, what they watch on the telly, what they read in the press, what they do on their social media, all that stuff. Love it. And will talk. And sometimes you can't get them to stop talking. So research is a joy in Africa. I love doing it even now. I did my last ever survey last year in Sudan.
So how do you conduct these surveys? I mean, how do you find a representative sample?
It's actually much easier than you might imagine. The only really difficult country to do it is Nigeria, because Nigeria is not very good at counting its own people. So the censuses in Nigeria have not been very well done even now. So we're not sure where the population is and where, how many there are. You can get around that by using Google Maps. We now have maps of Nigeria which are right up to date because pictures have been taken by satellite within the last 12 months, usually, and you can blow those up on your screen and you can actually select households just by using random numbers or some kind of grid. So Google Maps have made research like that very much easier. But even without, you can do that with households. You still don't know what the numbers of people are. But the best countries for censuses are countries like Sierra Leone, very good census quality, Gambia's very good census quality. Zambia's pretty good. Tanzania pretty good. You can get detailed population numbers right down to village level, and so it makes it quite, I won't say easy, but it's statistically reliable ways of sampling people using current data, using satellite delivered maps and census data where the enumeration areas are described, and you can match that with the maps and so on. And by the way, what's happened in Africa is that you now have a huge number of highly skilled, trained, well-disciplined market research, opinion research people who've done this time and time again, and they're competing now. And so they, one of the things that is good is that quality is improving all the time.
But how do they bring up access to international media in normal conversation? I mean, I can imagine if they're researching a soap brand or something like that. But how do you sidle up to somebody and say, "Oh, by the way, do you listen to the BBC?" Or
you don't sidle up and do that. You start off by saying, "Good morning. We've selected this household." And explain how that is done, and then you use a process of selection of persons in the household. You do not interview the person who answers the door. You might do, but you select the person in the household by a random system of numbers. You then explain the purpose of the research, which is always about we are researching how people use the media and communicate and get information. And ask them about the media they use. We usually start with the questions: how do you get information? Where do you get your news? Local news, national news, international news, that kind of thing. And then we also ask questions about the equipment you have at your house. Do you have a television set? Do you have a radio set? Do you have a mobile phone? Do you have a smartphone? Do you have cable? Do you have satellite? Do you have and that kind, you get into media in various ways like that, by the way. And the press is about asking people if they read newspapers, if they read magazines, when they last saw a newspaper, when they last saw a magazine, which one was it, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so and do you find that in various countries that, especially the access that women have to the radio, is dependent on what the man says they can listen to?
Can get worse than that. I'd never forget one of my colleagues who'd done a project, managed a survey in Morocco, and it was a very good example of why questionnaires are insufficient. He was in a household in a Berber village in the mountains, in the hilly, not right up in the mountains, but in the hills, in a fairly remote part of Morocco. And he'd been invited into the house to do his interviews. He wasn't doing it himself, by the way. He was supervising a local Moroccan Berber-speaking interviewer. And they'd finished the interviewing, and there wasn't much radio listening. Couldn't understand why, because there was a radio in the house, but it didn't appear that this woman ever listened to it much. Why? And at this point in the interview, a young man walked in, evidently her son, went to a cupboard, took out a bunch of keys, opened the cupboard, took out a radio, and locked it up and walked out of the house. And immediately he realized that the radio belonged to her son, and he wasn't letting her listen to it. Presumably he wanted to save the batteries, or maybe he didn't trust his mum to look after it properly, or switch it on or switch it off properly. But that was just, you find out things like that by happenstance. And it was true among Berber people. They true everywhere, of course. There were families who shared and shared the stuff they had. But in this particular household, this young man, who was obviously got a proper job and got income and so on and so forth, was staying with his mother. Or maybe he lived there all the time, but he kept his radio set under lock and key in a cupboard and took it out and used it.
Marvelous story. So let me ask you the question: what actually is the purpose of audience research? I mean, certainly in the 70s or 80s, wasn't it simply to prove that to the station funders, mainly governments, that it was having a measurable impact?
Well, that's one function. I always regarded that as of some importance, but not the most important thing. I wanted to provide audience research so that the makers of the program would be better equipped. I didn't want them to think that to be driven by audience research. I think once you start, it's that wonderful joke by Frank Muir observed, rather whimsically, the fate of the battleship Potemkin should teach us and remind us not to let the ratings take over. And it's true. It's not that, no, the numbers are important, but they're not the only thing that matters. The other thing that matters is the quality of what you're doing, the difference you make to people's lives, how they use you, how they put radio or TV, whatever it is, into their daily lives, and how it enriches them or doesn't, or educates them or doesn't, or entertains them or doesn't. So that's very important. So what I wanted to give my colleagues who were producers, and I'd been a producer, of course, not long before, I wanted to give them inspiration. I wanted to give them information that went beyond figures and would give them an idea of what was the place of the BBC in the lives of these people. And so what we started to do was not just surveys, quantitative surveys, we started to do qualitative research. And two great pioneers and leaders in qualitative research, Sue Robson and Mary Goodyear, came into the BBC and did a series of training sessions with some of the producers and my staff, my research staff, and really got something going, really inspiring. And they went to do Sue Robson didn't do projects for us. Mary Goodyear did the projects, because Mary Goodyear was then in a company called Market Behaviour Limited, which, with her husband, who died a couple of years back, she's still alive. They were leading members of that growing group of people who were pushing qualitative research, which doesn't count people. It gets in their heads and understands what's going on in here by getting them to talk in what are now called focus groups. I hate that word. I call them group discussions. Why do I think that? Because focus groups has got a bad name. It's sort of seen as a way of answering everything. It isn't. It's about understanding what motivates people. And we did a series of group discussions in all sorts of places all over the world, and that was mainly managed by Mary Goodyear with the company Market Behaviour Limited. Doesn't exist anymore. It's all swallowed up in one of the big huge market research conglomerates. But they did some brilliant work that really gave us an insight into what motivated people to listen to the BBC. Some of these quotes come, I can remember the one in a focus group or group discussion, I think it was in New Zealand. Don't ask us what BBC should be broadcasting. That's the whole beauty of the BBC. It surprises and delights us. Don't ask us what to do. That would be disaster. Of course, absolutely right. The BBC mustn't be driven by focus groups. It must be delighting them and giving them stuff which inspires and they enjoy and that's what, Michelangelo, when he was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, didn't run out into the street and ask people what color he should, it become, I mean, that's absurd, of course, but it is, audience research is qualitative research. It's about understanding how people use the media, but it should not be telling you what to put there. It might give you some ideas, and you might ask people, what do you think about this? That's fine, but don't make it drive the creativity.
Can you tell me a bit more about the important and comprehensive work by people like Carol Forrester for what was called, I think, the Mytton Matrix?
Oh, glory be, yes. Let me start with Carol, a wonderful Carol. She died of cancer. Terrible loss. Tragically young. I mean, she was only 50-something, 50s. Left school at 15, 16. Became a typist. But obviously had brilliant skills of forensic inquiry, of collecting stuff that she knew was interesting and worth keeping. She kept this archive of broadcasters and what they did, what languages they broadcast in, how many hours, how many minutes, what rebroadcasts they did of the BBC, what rebroadcasts they did of other radio stations. She kept files, cuttings, astonishing stuff. I mean, that stuff I suppose was done by Google or by similar search engines, but she had an ability to find things and to keep them, and she always knew where they were. She even wrote a peer-reviewed article for the European Journal of Communication with me, which, you know, there's not many people who left school to become typists who then write peer-reviewed articles in respected academic journals. And that led into the Mytton Matrix, which was a name I didn't give it. It was given. This was when John Tusa had this clever idea of always, on an annual basis, checking what you were doing, working out what you would cut if you had to cut 10% or 15% or 5%. I can't remember. They would give different figures each year what we had to cut. And what you would do if you had more money, what would you invest in? What would be your objectives for the year ahead? That kind of planning. And then come the middle of the 1990s, we got into a new scheme with the government whereby we wouldn't just have to bid for it money each year. We'd go have a quinquennium, a 5-year plan, a 5-year thing. It was it wasn't quinquennium, it was a 3-year triennium. A triennium, correct myself, it was a triennium. So we had to think ahead 3 years. And so we then got into serious planning, and we needed some way of working out what priorities ought to be. So we took language, we took areas of the world, and we took languages, and we took, you know, countries within those areas of the world, and had a matrix whereby we look, you know, what is the level of political freedom? What is the level of media development? Do people have radio sets? How many have radio sets? Do they have TV? Do they have satellite TV? Do they have cable? What's the economic situation in those countries? What is the level of local media development? Are the media controlled by the state? And so on. So we had this thing that went across, and the names of the countries or regions are down the side. And then we looked at it from the perspective of language. Does this particular language span many different countries? And what are the situations in those countries in terms of political freedom, level of development, level of media development, and so on and so forth. Or we also had a thing, strategic importance. I didn't like that at all, but we did it because we had to do it, because government thinks, well, we don't care about country X, but we do care about country Y. So there is that to take into account. I didn't like it very much, but there we are, political reality. I thought we ought to be doing what we ought to be doing in terms of human need. Kofi Annan had paid a great tribute to the BBC by saying, you know, if the world was to try and design and create a media system for the globe, it would not be far from the BBC. It was a very nice thing for him to say, and I know what he meant. We should never be arrogant enough to say that about ourselves. It would be outrageous if the BBC talked like that about itself. But if the General Secretary of the UN says it about us as a way of saying something important, that's great. And I thought of BBC being that. The BBC belongs to Britain, and one of the good things we have done for the world, and there's lots of bad things Britain did to the world, slavery and nastier forms of colonialism. But there was one good thing that Britain did to the world, which was to provide an international information system that was usually reliable, not always, usually gave both sides of the argument, not always, usually was fair, not always, usually was unbiased, not always. It made mistakes. The worst mistake it ever made was trying to balance things during the period of apartheid. There's no balance. We don't give an argument. There's no argument in favor of the kind of apartheid that South Africa was doing. By the way, I was responsible, I'm very proud of this, when I was still a producer, for actually having on the air 2 reporters in South Africa contradicting each other live. We had Clive Small saying, this is during 1976 Soweto uprising. And this is direct quote from what Clive Small, the BBC correspondent, said. At this point, the police were forced to open fire. Just think about that for a moment. Forced to open fire. I was the producer of the programme. We went across to Nat Sirache formerly Rand Daily Mail, the first ever South African black stringer reporting for the BBC. He was signed up to Focus on Africa, which was then, of course, in the World Service. It still is. I was on attachment to News and Current Affairs in Broadcasting House. So I was producing a program called World in Focus that used to go out from 7 o'clock on Radio 4. Natsarachi told a very different story from his side of the barricades. And he told the story, and of course, it was what he said was much more believable. And he was contradicting what Clive Small said, even though he had not heard what Clive Small reported. He might have even hung up the mic or whatever you do with a mic in protest at this, putting out this outrageous nonsense. But the listener could hear that it was outrageous nonsense because Natsarachi was telling the truth from the side of the black population that were being fired at that very moment. So I was very proud of that.
You mentioned situations where BBC made the mistakes. Would you say that that's around Suez and maybe the World in Rhodesia program that was broadcast?
The worst ever was Shaba in 1974-5. I'll look it out. I've written it all up, Jonathan. I was at the time a scriptwriter in the African service, and I was so ashamed at what the BBC had done. Just to cut a long story very short, in Shaba, a mining area in the southwest, the complicated story, but the gendarmes hadn't been paid, and there was an uprising there, and of people who the great problem about Congo or Zaire, Congo Kinshasa as we used to call it, was the communications in the country are very difficult, long distances. Often police and the army didn't get paid, and sometimes that could be exploited by people who saw a political chance to gain something through division. And so it happened, and there was a rebellion in Shaba, in the southwest of Congo, Zaire. And this was immediately seen as a threat to the expatriates living in that mining area. And there were a lot of expatriates, mainly Belgians, but French, Germans, Americans, British. And of course, they had to be rescued from these dangerous people. Which of course was nonsense. They didn't need to be rescued at all. They were not really under much of a threat. The real threat was to local people being caught in the crossfire of highly armed rival militia, or parts of the Congolese army or parts of the police force. And it was the BBC's response can be described by only one word: racist. We sent in 12 different reporters to Zaire to report, and it was all illustrated by how bad it was illustrated by the words of Stephen Jessel, who now retired, lives in Paris, but he was the Paris correspondent. But at that time, he was sent out to Zaire, along with several others, to report. And he actually, if you like, spilt the beans, because the airlift, there was a massive airlift from Europe and America to get all the white people under threat from these dreadful people out of Zaire. And the text of Jessel's report went like this: now that the safety of the Europeans is assured, attention turns to the fate of the local people. Now, Stephen knew what he was saying, and he knew it was racist, but he was actually reflecting what had happened. This is how the BBC and other news media behaved. The most important people were the whites, because, of course, everybody knows they are under threat. The lives of black people are expendable. It's an outrageous thing for me to say now, but it's true. I was so angry about that. I wrote a piece, and I wrote it, and I sent it to the then director of News and Current Affairs in the BBC, whose name escapes me at the moment, but it'll come to me. No, I can't. I became good friends with him, and I went to his funeral, and I can't remember his name. That 79-year-old brain 79-and-a-half-year-old brain cells are dying rapidly. But Richard, and it'll come to me. It'll come. And he refused to. He didn't accept it at the time. But when I saw him later after he retired, he came and very graciously said, "You were right, and I was wrong." What I was saying was that we need to be colorblind. The fate of one human being in Congo or Zaire is as equal to another, and we need to report all fairly. And the fact that our government was putting a priority on getting white people out of a dangerous situation is, I mean, that's if they want to take that position, but we need to stand back and say, well, actually, they're not as much under threat in terms of their lives than many of the local people who were caught in the crossfire of warring militia.
Okay, a few more questions for today. I'd like to ask you a bit about how the internet has revolutionized what we know about radio audiences, especially radio audiences.
It's done so in many ways. Of course, it's made possible a new form of transmission. You can transmit through the internet, and people can listen to you on their smartphones or on their computers. None of us had any idea how much the internet would change the world. And the mistake we made, I don't know if it applies to you, Jonathan, but it certainly applies to me and many others. We had no idea that it would be the mobile phone that would change everything. The smartphone has if you look at the predictions being made 20 years ago, the smartphone was nowhere. It wasn't. The first iPhones had just, when did they first appear? 2003, 2006, something like that. But the
iPhone was a bit later, but beforehand you had smartphones.
You had sort of smartphones, quasi smartphones like the Nokia, and I had one of those.
Yep.
I got given to me in 2003. Before that, there were the Blackberries as well. But there was nothing like the facility that you soon got. I did a survey in the Gambia. When was that? 2000 I can't remember. But I mean, even then, this is one of the poorest countries in the world. It was in the mid-noughties, in Gambia. You find 30% penetration of phones with some texting and other capabilities. Where they weren't fully internet capable, but they were already making a revolutionary change to Gambians' daily lives, particularly in the field of farming and fishing. People could now sell their produce at the best price, and especially with fish, because it goes off very quickly. You could sell it. It made a huge change. And of course, being able to text information to fishmongers or to shops or to market traders, it made a huge change. And I saw that when I did my survey in the Gambia. So the internet, it's a complicated answer. We thought the internet would be important for email, for messages and so on and so forth. We never imagined the change that would happen because of the smartphone. The smartphone is now the way most people in the world access the internet, by far. And this came home to me when I did the last survey ever in my life, which was last year in the Sudan. I did my first survey in 1967 in Tanzania. I did my last in 2020 in Sudan. And Sudan, which all previous surveys had said, radio's number one, television's right up there too. This time, everything overwhelmed by the smartphone. Sudan is now a smartphone economy. Terms of media. Most people, most of the time, are using their smartphones to get the news, to contact their relatives, to send money. By the way, what a huge thing that is in Africa. Leads the world in money, sending money. How do people send money? Smartphones. How did they used to send money? They used to send postal orders, or they used to send cash with a friend or something like that. How do people, earning money in the towns, get money back to their impoverished mums and dads, uncles and aunts and cousins back in the villages? They used to use money sending, Western Union or similar, but now it's all done on smartphones. And
so where does this leave? I mean, you mentioned Sudan there. Where does this leave shortwave stations like Radio de Banga Are they no longer effective, or are they
They are
using?
effective, and shortwave is still important. And it may not be important for very much longer, but it's still very important. By the way, the BBC's made some mistakes since I left, not because I left, nothing to do with that. They're mistakes I can fully understand, and I might have made them myself. And that was to wind down shortwave far too early. I know there were cuts, 2009, the crash and all that. There were real hard choices to be made, and they probably made most of the right choices. But cutting shortwave was done for the wrong reasons. The shortwave was still a tremendously powerful medium and still hugely used, especially in areas of great poverty and great political upheaval.
A couple more questions. And bringing up to date. I mean, BBC World Service has gone through gigantic changes since you've left. When,
Yeah.
when did you leave?
I
2000 and
left in no, I didn't much. I
really?
left in 1998. I con-
Okay.
I continued to do some work for them for the next decade, mainly in qualitative research and mainly for the governors. I did a lot of work for the governors, looking at how well informed listeners would judge the output. It was trying to give the governors an independent way of reviewing the quality of the output, and I did that for until about 2005.
Well, but modern claims about audience size is it's many times higher than in the days of shortwave radio, which was what, about 120 million? So
It was quite a bit higher than that. I haven't got the full information on my computer, but I can look it out for you, Jonathan, and I can give you a full account of the audience, the
okay,
measured audience over several years. I haven't got it to hand, but I can
okay,
certainly
well,
do it.
okay,
It certainly is now 2 or 3 times 120. It's in the region of just under half a billion now.
so how do you compare the
What
radio
worries,
station
I'm
today?
a little, I don't think they're being dishonest. I don't think they're fiddling it.
Yeah.
I do need a bit more, and I've got to get in touch with them, and I'm going to ask the new head of audio, the new man in charge of that side of things. The structure's a little bit different. There's no equivalent to me anymore, um, in quite the same position. But there is a person in charge of the audience measurement and the audience research, including the qualitative. And I can ask him, and I'm going to ask him to just give me a little bit more information. For example, are they? I know they're very keen not to double count. It's almost impossible not to double count if you're taking your data from different sources. Their main source of information is face-to-face surveys, and of course there's media metrics. And of course the metrics do not measure people; they measure devices. And so they have algorithms for coping with that and making sense of that and making sure it's about people, not about devices. But I worry a little bit about stopping double counting. I'm sure they're doing everything they can to make sure they're not double counting. But the other thing I'm worried about is, are they measuring uh, audiences for the main World Service activity, be it on television, online, or radio? Are they including audiences for BBC shows which are obtained commercially? I don't, that's a different kind of kettle of fish, and you're not comparing like with like. The 120 million did not include that. Does this new figure include that? I don't think it should. Does it? I need to find out.
And how do you compare the station today with, when just before you, at the end of the last century,
Uh,
quality wise?
in terms of output,
Yeah.
I think it's outstanding as ever, but there's some losses. Network Africa is gone, and that was a huge shame. Its replacement, Newsday, is a shadow of that program. Network Africa had this great ability to engage with audiences and to get them to be creative part of the program. That doesn't happen anymore. The other thing that I really dislike, and it's not just because I'm deaf, it is the decline in the quality of diction. It used to be very important, because of shortwave, for everybody to speak clearly and to make sure that words were separated and that consonants were clearly enunciated. I'm exaggerating it slightly. We often mock the way in which commentators used to speak. But the good thing about those weird ways of talking was that you could get every word. Nowadays, I sometimes have to switch the radio off because I cannot follow what is being said. And I find I'm not alone. And it worries me that the World Service, which should be the exemplar of how to broadcast in English, surely, and in other languages too, but especially English, it's our national language, they really ought to slow down, stop gabbling, stop mispronouncing, and stop running words together and taking breaths in the middle of sentences and running this sentence I'm speaking in now right into the next one without a break. We have to remember that a lot of our listeners, English is their second language, not their first. And,
do you think Brexit has made an impact on the credibility of BBC World Service in other countries?
I'm sure it has. I don't think it's deserved, but I think that our image in the world has been damaged by Brexit because it makes us look, am I expressing an opinion? I shouldn't express an opinion. I'm BBC impartial, but there are things about Brexit that go against the grain as far as the BBC is concerned. We try to be inclusive. We try to be internationalist. We try to be citizens of the world. It's quite difficult to do that in harmony with the kind of arguments used in favour of Brexit, of wanting to do things ourselves, taking back control, and so on and so forth. It's possible to do it. There is an argument to be made, but that is inclusive and global and fair and kind and outward going, but it isn't made. If you can take yourself back to the opening and the closing, but especially the opening of the 2012 Olympics. By the way, my daughter, Emily Mytton, who is an actor and a movement director, was part of that, and she helped Danny Boyle create the opening sequence, of which I am hugely proud of my daughter for doing. But you see, that was an inclusive, that was Britain welcomes the world. Britain does things with people from other cultures and we welcome them. It's difficult to imagine that happening in a Brexit Britain. It would still be true, I hope. It is still the Britain I love and the Britain I want to live in, but it's been damaged. There's no doubt about that. And Brexit does not have to do that, and it has done it, and it seems such a tragedy to me.
Okay, a couple more questions. I'm curious about what your preferred future is for the world of international broadcasting. If it's 2031, how do you think we're going to look back on this current decade?
Well, I think the great sadness of this decade is how we are being so blind to our own unkindness and our own lack of generosity. The events in the Channel have pointed that up to me, and I can't think about it without welling up. There are people dying who don't deserve at the beginnings of their lives, with their future ahead of them, and they're lost in there and they're drowned in the sea. What was the question again? Oh yes, we'll look back at that with horror, as we look back at the Holocaust with horror, and the horror is the same. People dying, and they're dying because of not necessarily direct murder like in Germany, but through neglect or through not thinking this person matters. He matters more than immigration control or taking back control. All these things, these lives of these people are precious. They're just as precious as my life or your life or the Queen's life or Boris Johnson's life. The other thing we will look, but there's another aspect. Let's look at the technology side of it, the kind of what international broadcasting is about, international communication. So we now have a new system. It's called the internet, and it's smartphones and so on and so forth. So the big challenge now is the challenge of fake news and the challenge of misuse of social media and the misuse of data, big data, and the control that it gives. What are we talking about? 6 or 7 individuals, Bezos, Zuckerman, and so on, these tiny number of very, very powerful people who have this kind of control. And that, so whereas the BBC World Service and Radio Netherlands and Deutsche Welle and Voice of America and all these were funded or brought about by a desire to have influence, to have political power, to have or to allow free movement of information, all these different motivations, mostly in the case of BBC and Radio Netherlands and Deutsche Welle and to some extent Radio France International, and to some extent the best parts of Voice of America before it had its bad, the government trying to control it more. These were good things. They were good things because they tried to increase information, to increase access to. They become irrelevant if the internet genuinely is what it should be, which is free information for all without the control of any marketing, commercial, capitalistic dominance or control. That's the danger. And fake news and all the rest of it, and the things that happened with Donald Trump and all of that is a terrifying thing, especially at a time when we are in danger of becoming, of the world becoming inundated with water. The end of the world, the beautiful world that we have, and something too horrific to contemplate as a result of global warming. So that if well, international broadcasting becomes an irrelevance, but what it stood for is still important, and we all hope and pray that things can come right, and that the internet and smartphone and all that gives us the opportunity to help the world understand where it is at and what it needs to do and how it needs to do it.
Is the BBC good at keeping its audio treasures? I say that because the BBC Sounds app is brimming with old and new material from its domestic service, but it's much harder to find material from BBC World Service, especially in languages other than English.
I don't know if that's entirely true. There are other language items which are in the archives. I know that because I know the archive of the Hausa service, which is now being annotated and catalogued and digitized. But maybe more needs to be done. We lost a lot of stuff. There is a period, I may have mentioned this to you before, Jonathan, there is a period of loss, which is not so much with the sound stuff, but in the period when all organizations went from being entirely paper-based in terms of their archive to being digitized, which is what it is now. And there's a kind of period in between where a lot of stuff was lost because nobody thought, oh gosh, that's all on email. Oh, I've ditched that. That's gone. So that's one worry I have. There is a problem of we used to select stuff and put it on vinyl disc. It had a kind of form. It was on tape. We all know that tape suffers from print through and it degrades. Or there's always a worry it degrades. Actually, it lasts incredibly well, but never mind. The BBC policy was to put it on vinyl. I don't get a sense, I may be wrong, that there's anybody sitting down and saying we need to make sure we digitize that or we keep that. I don't know. Maybe they are, but I worry that maybe they're not. I don't know.
Thank you very much indeed for today.
Lovely to talk to you. It's been an enjoyable afternoon.
It has indeed. Likewise. So
who's going to press the leave button first? I hate doing it.
I will do that.